So today I'd like to talk about Voltaire's philosophical novel or philosophical tale Candide. Now, we call it a philosophical novel or a philosophical tale, and Voltaire is known as the author of what we call contes philosophiques, whereas in fact in many respects Voltaire is an anti-philosophical writer, at least in a certain sense. He's not interested in the stock image of the philosopher as someone who just thinks, who's in an ivory tower. For example, in the 17th century, the cliché, the emblematic philosopher was René Descartes, who was sitting in his room somewhere in Holland when he came up with this idea of I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, je pense donc je suis, so cut off from the world. Now the 18th century was not as interested in abstract metaphysical speculation for the sake of it. The philosophe, we often talk about the intellectuals of the period with the French term philosophe rather than philosopher, because they were not philosophers so much as public intellectuals who are committed to certain ideals of justice, freedom and so forth, obviously ideas that will culminate in the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity. And Voltaire was a very politically committed person. He was involved in many attempts to help people who were being persecuted, for example Protestants in 18th century France, for example Jean Calas, for example, and he did this often through his writing, through polemical texts and through philosophical treatises and so forth. And one formulation, one phrase that he says, which I find very useful and typical of him, is he's distinguishing himself from one of his main rivals, the Genevan philosopher and intellectual Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Voltaire says, Jean-Jacques n'écrit que pour écrire, et moi j'écris pour agir. Jean-Jacques writes for writing's sake, but I write in order to act. And I think that this is one of those a key formulation for Voltaire, because he is not interested in pure verbiage, metaphysical speculation, but he wants to be involved and he wants his writing to be committed. Okay, so how does this relate to Candide? What's interesting in Candide is that there are various characters who are dubbed philosophers, and yet they are not written. They do not write for writing's sake, but they do talk quite a lot. The two main philosophers in the text are Ponglos, Candide's tutor, and later on he meets someone called Martin, who's also described as a philosopher as well. Now these two philosophers are not writers. Their function within the text and their job basically seems to be to speak a lot of the time. Ponglos' name comes from the Greek pan-glossa, meaning all tongue, and indeed, this already implies that his philosophy is mostly speech, ephemeral speech rather than sort of written words. The word gloss as well, glosser, to gloss, in an intellectual context also tends to mean to give a commentary or an interpretation of a pre-existing text. And I think this is a revealing way into thinking about Ponglos, because he doesn't produce a philosophy out of nowhere. He is always responding to things that have happened before. Now, Voltaire shows the ridiculousness of Ponglos' reasoning in chapter 1 of the text, where he reasons, for example, that we have noses and we wear glasses, and therefore that proves that noses were designed simply to wear glasses. We wear trousers and we have legs, and that shows that legs were therefore designed so that we have trousers. So he gets his logic topsy-turvy in lots of ways. And Ponglos sticks to this philosophy through thick and thin. Even at the end of the work, he hasn't really progressed from this basic starting point. He says at the end, were it not for all of these adventures and experiences that we've been through, these quite harrowing experiences, we wouldn't have ended up where we are now, enjoying ourselves in the Mediterranean sun, eating pistachios and fruit. And so Ponglos sticks to this expectation, this understanding of the world, that everything has to be fated the way it is, because this is the best of all possible worlds and everything is for the best. Anything that seems as though it's bad actually is just a step towards something good, or it's good on some other sort of level. And Voltaire shows us from the start how inappropriate that approach is. The whole work is basically setting a conflict between theory and practice, between Ponglos' philosophical ideas and the reality of life as it's depicted, which is full of savagery, brutality, injustice, and so forth. But Voltaire isn't content just to show that Pongloss's philosophy is ridiculous and topsy-turvy. He also suggests at certain points that actually it's quite dangerous. There's a point quite early on where Ponglos and Candide are sailing towards Lisbon, and one of the other characters, Jacques the Anabaptist, ends up drowning in the sea. Candide's first impulse is to go and rescue him, and Ponglos holds him back, proving, according to Voltaire, that the whole of Lisbon and the area around it had been designed simply that Jacques the Anabaptist would fall in there and drown. And so, again, Voltaire is showing not only that Ponglos's philosophy is misguided, but that it actually stops people from doing the right sort of things, because it works. So it doesn't just work retrospectively, saying that everything that has happened had to have happened, but it even prevents people from doing good things in the future or in the present. So Voltaire is undermining Ponglos's philosophy on various different levels. Ponglos isn't just speaking instead of acting, he is speaking in order to stop other people acting and doing charitable good deeds in real life. And we get various other examples of that in the text as well. Later on, Candide is ill, and there are various doctors who try to treat him, and in fact the treatments make Candide still worse than he was to start with. So again, Voltaire is suggesting that their narrow-minded adherence to a particular understanding of the world, or in this case the human body and what should work, actually has prevented them from curing him and actually does more harm than good. So sometimes what people say and what they do can be completely at odds, and even Candide himself, he's the hero and very innocent and in many respects a very positive figure, falls into that trap himself. At one point when he's accidentally killed his beloved's brother, he's in despair about this, saying, how could anyone eat at a time like this? What a terrible situation I'm in. And then Voltaire points out that while he was saying that, he's still munching away on some pork, I think it is, I can't remember. So Voltaire is showing that there can often be a mismatch between reality and the words that people use to describe it. But sometimes Voltaire does suggest that talking philosophically, engaging in some sort of philosophical dialogue, can have its advantages. If we go back to the case of when they arrive at Lisbon, it's at the point of the Lisbon earthquake, which happened in 1755, a genuine historical event that really shook a lot of Enlightenment thinkers' trust in nature, which they often assumed had been a force for good, or at least a morally neutral force. So they're confronted with the devastation that befalls this city, and Candide and Ponglos both help here. They help out the survivors, help to try to find the various survivors. So at this case at least, Ponglos is acting rather than talking. Later on then, that evening, after they've rescued some survivors, there is a rather sombre meal between them and some of the other people. And Voltaire tells us that Ponglos consoled the other people there by reassuring them, by proving to them that this was fated to happen. There was nothing they could do about it, and this was part of the bigger plan, and this is still the best of all possible worlds. Now, Voltaire is probably being ironic in this case. We are not told how the other people responded, whether they really were consoled, although Voltaire uses that word, console, in that case. But it does remind us that Ponglos at least sticks to that philosophy, even when, later on he admits, he's lost faith in it. He still repeats it as his mantra, even when he doesn't believe it, because it seems to bring him some sense of succor or consolation. And this is an idea that would sometimes, that Voltaire would deal with in some of his other works as well. There's one work, a lesser-known story called Histoire de Génie, where he approaches that question of, is it better to believe in a religion, in a god that is actually false, but at least teaches you right and wrong, or gives you a sense of purpose in life, or is it better to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be a total atheist and have no faith in anything? So he's aware that sometimes it can be useful at least to believe in something, even if that something is not actually empirically founded in reality. Now, there's a more genuine example of consolation as a result of philosophical talk that comes up later on in the work. Again, on a ship, actually. Later on, Candide has parted ways with Ponglos, and he has then been teamed up with the philosopher called Martin, who is, he calls himself, a Manichean, which means that he believes that the world is sort of being torn between two forces of good and evil, although Martin actually seems to tend towards assuming that the world has gone to the dogs, that the devil is in charge of everything. They discover that the evil Dutchman, Monsieur Van de Dondure, has just been drowned with a ship as he's sailing off, having stolen Candide's wealth. And Candide leaps on this as an example of how sometimes the wicked in this world are punished. Martin then punctures this by saying, well, God might have drowned Monsieur Van de Dondure, but the devil must have drowned all of the other people on the ship. And then this leads to a discussion between the two of them, presumably about the nature of justice in the world and the role of God and fate and all of these things. We're not told what the content of their discussion is. Rather, it then their discussion shifts into indirect speech. We're told what they're talking about, but not what they actually say. They carry on this conversation for the next 2 weeks as they're sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. And Voltaire tells us that when they arrive, their conversation is no more progressed than it was when they started. So he seems to be again telling us that philosophical discussion doesn't have any real purpose. But Voltaire also points out, but at least they were talking, they were communicating, they were sharing ideas, and they were consoling themselves, consoling each other. Ils se consolaient. And I think this is an important point. It's that word consolation being brought in again in relationship to philosophical discussion. In this case, it's not the same as Ponglos preaching to a group of survivors of the Lisbon earthquake, consoling them. We might, as I've said, we might want to mistrust whether he was actually, genuinely consoling them. But in this case, with the dialogue, with the sharing of ideas, the communication of ideas seems to genuinely produce some sense of consolation in Martin and Candide. So Voltaire is saying that it's not necessarily the result that counts. It's not he doesn't tell us how their conversation ends up, except to say that they hadn't progressed at all. But he does point out that it's a point of contact, it's a point of human engagement with other people, with other ideas, rather than preaching from one person to another. It's discussing that there's a merit in that, and that is more important than the outcome. And of course, as I said earlier, Ponglos is always obsessed with the outcome. Everything that happens, he sees as the outcome of a natural order that will lead up to that one particular point. And right at the end of the novel, as I said, he says that, well, we needed to go through all of that in order to have our sort of happy ending here. Now, Voltaire is very aware that there is no such thing as an ending in real life. Every time Ponglos tries to interpret things as though that's the end, things carry on, and life will carry on after the end of the story. People often quote Candide's final lines, "Il faut cultiver notre jardin," we need to cultivate our garden. Here, Candide is suggesting we need to get on with action, or at least with activity, which is useful, pragmatic, maybe not very exciting and dramatic, but it carries up, we're growing food, we're catering for ourselves and for other people, we're just getting on with life. People often tend to forget the little bit just before those final words, which is that Candide says to Ponglos, "Cela est bien dit," that's well said, well spoken, mais il faut cultiver notre jardin, but we have to cultivate our garden. So Voltaire is contrasting words with action. So to go back to my original starting point, that quotation about writing or sometimes speaking in order to act, Candide as a novel doesn't act in any particular way, but what it does do is it exposes that mismatch between words and action, between theories, metaphysical ideas about how the world works, and the reality that we see. And I think that that's probably one of the most interesting ways to think about this text, is that it challenges that instinct that we all have to try to make sense of the world, rather, as Candide says, we need to get on with doing things like cultivating our garden.